friends, welcome back to Digitalk, and in this session I am going to talk about some different parameters of the data sources, specifically when we talk about the initial connections, minimum connections and maximum connections. These are the some important parameters of data sources, and many times I had a discussion with many engineers and I felt that many engineers get confused between the difference between initial capacity or minimum capacity and maximum capacity, how we can specify that one. Okay, what would be the recommendation for defining the connections, right? And then apart from that, there are different states of the data sources that we can manage from the console. We can check the status of data sources, and then there are different states like start, stop, shutdown, suspend. What is the difference between all of them? Okay, so I'm going to explain all of these parameters in this particular session, right? So before that one, let me start my domain first. Okay, let me go to my domain, and first me start my node manager. Okay, and let me start my admin server as well. Okay, this is in production mode and I have not created the security securities file, so it is prompting me for the username and password. Okay, let me enter the username and password. Let me see the status. So node manager is up and running and admin server is starting. Okay, but it will take some time based on the configuration of your systems, the RAM that you have defined and multiple things. And then let me go and access my console. Okay, okay, now it is running. Let me see the status of my servers. Okay, so my managed servers are running because earlier when I had stopped my admin server, I haven't stopped my managed servers. Okay, so now I have a domain where I have one admin server and two managed servers are running in a cluster. Okay, let me take a look of my application. Okay, so I have a test DS application, okay, which is a web application which is deployed in the cluster running in the both managed servers, right? And for this application, I need one data source. Let me see, right? So this is the disabled DS data source that is configured. So let me click on my data source. Okay, then once you will click on your data source, okay, there are different tabs and there are different options inside each and every tab. Okay, so one by one in multiple sessions I am going to explain all of the important parameters and properties that need to be configured or associated with your data source. Okay, so as I said, in this particular session we are going to discuss about the initial capacity, minimum capacity, maximum capacity and different states of the data sources, right? So let us first talk about the different states of the data sources. Okay, and before that one, if you would like to monitor your data sources, you click on the monitoring tab. Okay, so once you will click on the monitoring tab, you have two options, statistics and the testing. Okay, inside the statistics you can see the status of your data source, which is enabled true, it is running, and the driver that you have specified. If you would like to test your data source if it is working or not properly, okay, because sometimes in for many time when we do the troubleshooting, we felt that there would be a problem with the data sources or connection pool. It is not creating the connections or the connections are dropping. There would be a lot of situations where you need to test your data source if it is reaching to your data source database or not. For that you have to click on testing, and then you have to click on each of the managed server to test the connection if it is going successful or not from each and every managed server, right? Because we have multiple times managed servers are running in a cluster which is on different systems, so there could be a problem that there would be some network problem between your host machine and then database machine. Okay, so that's why you have to test each and every data source or each and every managed server connections, right? So select any of the managed server and click on test data source. Okay, you can see the test is was successful, right? That means for managed server 2 it is successful, right? And similarly you can click on other data source or other managed server name and check the connection is successful. That means you are able or your machine is able to connect with the database, and your Weblogic server is able to connect with your database. That means everything is fine there, right? So this is the purpose of your monitoring, statistics and the testing, right? And then you have a control, right? So it is, this control is same like for the managed servers, where we go to the control tab and to the shutdown and startup of our managed servers, right? So here you can have the same uh, options for the different connections pool as well, different data sources as well. Okay, for example, if I would like to do certain operations on a data source which is targeted to my managed server 1 or maybe both, okay, for that you have to select that particular data source managed server name. If you wanted to do the operation for all of the managed server, then you can select all. Okay, and then the different options are start, resume, shutdown and force shutdown, suspend and force suspend, clear statement cache, reset and shrink. Right. So let me talk about first shutdown. Right. It's a simple shutdown command that if you just like we bring down our managed servers, after that it's not able to process any request, right? Because it is shut down. Same way, if your data source is processing some transactions, it is taking some connections, and due to any reasons you would like to shut down that particular data source on particular managed server. Okay, in that case you have to select the that particular managed server and then you can click on the shutdown or force shutdown. Shutdown in the sense it will wait for some time for the active connection to be closed and then it will shut down your data source. If you click on force shutdown, it will shut down your data source forcibly. Okay, that means it will close all of the connections which is currently in use and then it will completely shut down your database. Okay, so let me show you. If I click on the shutdown and then click on ms1, then you can see that this particular data source is shut down on managed server 1. Okay, and the reason could be I am doing some maintenance of the managed server 1 where I am doing some kind of a troubleshooting. Okay, and I don't want to be any connection to be created for, or wait for the connections from that particular managed server. So I am uh, doing the shutdown of that particular server data source. Right, so now you can see the data source is in shutdown state. If you would like to start that again, then click on the start option and then your data source will be started. Right. Similarly, I show you the shutdown, so you can do click on the force shutdown as well. Okay, if any active connections are there, it will shut down of the all of the connections. Right, and again you can click and then you can click on the start, and then it will be in the any state. Right. So after that, you have options suspend and force suspend. So suspend is just like a shutdown as well, but there is a bit difference. Okay, when we shut down the connection pool, it completely shut down. It close all the connections from the data source, all the active connections get closed, and then no one able to create the new connections. Okay, but when we click on the suspend, okay, so suspend we sometimes use when we do certain kind of a maintenance on our database side for a particular instance in the backend, because in the real environment we have multiple backend instances of databases. If we are doing certain kind of a maintenance on any instance or we are doing any kind of a troubleshooting, okay, what we want here is we want the current connection, the transaction that is going on should be up and running. Okay, with no further new connections are get created. Okay, but there should not be any impact on the current transaction, that will go as it is. Okay, so in that case it will preserve all of the state of the connections which is there as of now in your connection pool when you are going to suspend. For example, I am going to suspend this connection pool. Okay, so at that time it will preserve all the states of the connections that is there in your data source as it is, and all the connection which is going in a transaction at that particular moment, they will go as it is. There is no impact on that one. Okay, so now you can see the state of my data source is suspended. Right, so after suspend, if you would like to resume, for that you will get an option now, resume. Okay, click on resume and then click yes. Now you can see that your data source is again in the running state. Okay, now you have a clear statement cache. Okay, for that you have to understand what exactly is clear statement cache. Okay, for that I have posted some more videos on the data sources where I have explained what exactly is statement cache size. Okay, but for now what you can understand is that for performance perspective, to improve the performance, what data source exactly does is whenever our applications connect with the database and then it fetching some kind of a data, it is executing a lot of queries, PLSQL procedures, triggers, right? So most frequently queries or the procedures kind of a things, okay, it get cache in your data source which is in the statement cache. Okay, so for any reason if you would like to clear that particular statement cache, okay, for that we have this option clear statement cache. Okay, but most of the time we do not use this option. This is not practically used because uh, it will get clear all of the statement cache from your data sources, and which can bit degrade the performance. There are certain use cases where we use this one. Okay, but however most of the time we do not use this particular options. Okay, and then you have an option to shrink, and then you have a reset. Okay, so now what exactly shrink is that we have, if you know about, we have a maximum capacity of a connection pool, right? For example, if I define the maximum capacity as 70. Okay, so that means at a moment your data source can create 70 concurrent connections to the database, right? Suppose that you have a 60, 70 or 80 requests are coming to your connection pool or your data source. Okay, at that moment, if you have defined the maximum capacity as 70, then that means it can cater or it can take the 70 concurrent requests at a time to create the connection to the database, right? But that could be a peak period, right? At a peak period of time, the utilization would be till maximum capacity, which is 70, right? And after that, when the peak period is down, okay, then the utilization again go back to the normal uses, like for 30, 40, 20 connections are in use, okay, off peak time period, right? But in that case, if your connection pool has reached to the maximum capacity at any time, like 70, okay, then it will preserve the same number of connections in your connection pool. Okay, even the utilization of your connection pool by the application will drill down to 20, 30 or 40. Okay, but because your connection pool has reached to the maximum utilization to 70, which was 70, okay, so it will not clear that automatically. It will keep all the 17 at 70 active connections in your connection pool. However, the utilization would maybe 20, 30 or 40, right? So for that we use a shrink option. Okay, so what exactly shrink option is does is it shrink your connection pool back to the current utilization, and all of the connections pool those were created in the pool but were not in use, unnecessary taking the resources, will drill down to the back to the normal utilization. So this is the purpose of your shrink option. Okay, so most of the time we do, if we think that the utilization of connection pool is very high, and when you think that the database performance is not well, your connection, your managed servers are not responding properly, we are getting the same performance kind of issues with respect to your applications, then in that case you can try this option to shrink this one. Okay, so if you have any active pools in the connection, those are not in use, so it will shrink all of those connections. Okay, so now when we talk about the reset property, so it's very clear from the name as well. It will reset your connection pool. That means suppose if you have a connection pool where you have a 40 or 50 active connections, 20 or 30 connections are in use, 30, 40, 20, 10 or 20 connections are not in use but active in connection pool. So when you click on the reset, it will completely clear the connection pool. Okay, and then it will create all the new connections from the beginning. Okay, so this is again an option that we hardly use because it clear complete connections from the connection pool, or your active connections will get be rolled back, right? And then it will again clean, and then it will restart the connections pool. When it is used sometime in the troubleshooting as well, when your applications getting some problems, and then you're getting some exceptions in the log files where your database is creating certain application is creating a certain kind of a problem, it is not able to connect with your data source, or you are getting some intermittent kind of issues with respect to the connectivity with your database. In that case, we can use the reset option so that we can start a fresh connections from our connection pool. Okay, so these are the different options we see inside the control tab. Okay, so far what we have seen is that we talk about the monitoring and testing statistics, right, and the control tab and the different options that we have inside the control tab, right? And let us go back and then we see the different parameters. Okay, so now we are going to discuss about the initial capacity, minimum capacity and maximum capacity. These are the three important parameters that we configure inside our connection pool. Okay, so let me first show you the definition from the Oracle side for the initial capacity, minimum capacity and maximum capacity. So what is initial capacity? The number of physical connections to create when creating the connection pool in the data source. The maximum capacity is the maximum number of physical connections that this connection pool can contain, and the minimum number of physical connections that this connection pool can contain after it's initialized. Okay, so now the important thing here to see between the initial capacity and minimum capacity is the initial capacity is saying the number of physical connections to create when creating the connection pool. And when we talk about the minimum capacity, it talk about after it is initialized. Now this is the major difference between your initial capacity and minimum capacity. So initial capacity is applicable when your connection pool is creating. And what is the situation when connection pool creates? When you start your servers. When you start your servers, at that time your data source get initialized, right? So that means initial capacity is applicable when you are starting your application or you are restarting your data sources. Okay, and then when we talk about the minimum capacity, it is applicable after it is initialized. That means when you are, suppose you are starting your server managed server where you have data sources targeted, and once your server is up and running, it is active now, after that this minimum capacity is initialized. So one thing is very clear, initial capacity is applicable when your data sources are getting initialized. For example, when we start our managed servers or admin servers, minimum capacity is applicable when our data sources is initialized. That means it is already started. And maximum capacity is also applicable when our data source is initialized, right? So now what is initial capacity? Okay, so let us understand it in a way that multiple applications has dependency on the data sources, and when we start our application servers like managed servers where the data sources are deployed, applications are deployed, at that time application need to connect to the database for proper functioning or for the startup of the proper startup of the applications, right? For example, if I talk about the middleware applications, Fusion middleware applications, so for most of the middleware applications, the metadata of the applications are stored in the database. Okay, so that means when we are going to start our application server, at that particular moment, that application which is deployed on the managed server need to connect with the database to fetch the metadata so that it can start up properly, right? So for that means we need certain kind of initial connections that need to be initialized when we are starting our managed servers. Okay, and even if you have a certain kind of applications where there is no direct dependency on the database, for example, we have some custom applications, web applications, those does not have any dependency on the database. But when we whenever our database or application servers are up and running, and when the client started accessing the applications, at that time it connect to the database and fetch the database for the certain kind of transactions. For that, in that case, you really have to define a very less number of initial connections, because at the startup time you really don't need the database connections. When we talk about the Fusion middleware applications or any kind of a custom applications which has a dependency on the database at the startup time of your applications, for that you have to define the initial capacity, and that initial capacity would be minimum. Okay, minimum in the sense the minimum connections that is required to be connected with the database for your application to work properly. Okay, so practically when we talk about what is the calculation of to defining the initial capacity, for that you can define around 10 to 15% or 20% of the your maximum capacity as an initial capacity, which is would be sufficient. So if I talk about, if you have a maximum capacity of 400, okay, then you can take the 10% or 20% of that, which is 40 or 60, okay, or 70 or 80, that you can define as an initial capacity. Okay, so this is the definition of initial capacity, where it is required and why it is required. So now when we talk about the minimum capacity, so once your data source is initialized, right, after that you have to define the minimum capacity. That means the minimum number of connections that will be maintained in the connection pool. Okay, so what exactly is a connection pool? As I said earlier in the lectures as well, connection pool is a ready to use connections. So ready to use connections, that means the connections that is already established with the database and ready to use in the connection pool. It improves the performance, right? Because your application don't need to create the connection at the runtime when it need the connection. It always pick the connection from the pool which is already established connection from the database, right? So minimum capacity is a capacity that the number of connection always be ready to use in your connection pool. For example, if I define 100 number of as my minimum capacity, okay, that means 100 number of active connections, already established connections, will remain in my connection pool. So whenever my application needs the connection from the connection pool, it will take the ready to use connection from the minimum capacity. So now if suppose that if I have defined my minimum capacity as 100, and certain times the connection utilization goes over 100, like 120, 200, 250, so from where the more connection will come, that will come from the maximum capacity, right? And now for example, if I have defined the maximum capacity as 400, okay, and my minimum capacity was 100, and at any time the utilization is going above the 100, at that time the rest of the connection will get created dynamically at the runtime according to the needs. Okay, and that bit kind of a degrade the performance, because again it going to create the further requirement at a runtime. So for that, what exactly we do most of the time, we define the maximum and minimum capacity same. Okay, this is recommended for the connection pool parameter performance, and the reason is that because if we are defining the maximum capacity and minimum capacity same, that means whatever is our maximum capacity requirement we are giving to minimum as well, that means the same number of pools connections will be ready to use in the pool always. Okay, so your application don't need to create the new connections or new demand at the run time. Okay, but it is again an overhead because those are already established connection to your database, so that means they are taking certain kind of resources always, right? Because they are the active connections. Okay, so there is a plus and minus for all. If you are going to make minimum and maximum capacity same, it will enhance the application performance, but again it is going to take certain kind of resources from your system. But if you have a higher configurations in the backend for your database and application servers, then exactly you don't need to worry about that one, right? So these are the definitions of your initial capacity, maximum capacity and minimum capacity. Then how we can define that one? As I said, for initial capacity you can take the calculation as around 15 to 20% of your maximum capacity. Okay, and then the minimum capacity and maximum capacity that you can define as same for the application performance perspective. And anytime you would like to see the utilization of your data sources and what is the utilization of my data sources, what is the number of connections that is getting created in my data sources, for that you can click on your data sources tab and then click on monitoring, and then you will see here the active connections average count, active connections current count, active connections high count. Okay, so active connection high count will give you the total number of higher number of connections that has been created in this particular data source since you have restarted your data managed server where it is deployed. Okay, for example, if I have restarted my server 2 days back, that means since I have restarted since till today, at the moment, whatever the higher number of connections that has been created in this particular pool will be displayed here, which is active connections high count. Okay, if my connection maximum capacity is 400, and if anytime I see that the active connection high count is going more than 400, that means I have to increase the maximum capacity of my connection pool, because the higher number of active connection is going till 400 or above that one. So that means any request that will go beyond 400 will get queued, right? Unless the connection will get free. So that means you have to increase the connection pool capacity here. Okay, and this is the current number of count that you are in your applications for now, and this is would be the average connection count. And if you click on customize this table, then you will see a lot of other options as well that you can monitor for this one. Okay, and then a lot of other parameters, important parameters are there as well that we will discuss in for our next sessions. Okay, and apart from that one, let me tell you one more thing. When we go for increasing our this particular parameter, or which is called a maximum connection pool, right? Whenever we are going to increase it, suppose from 400 to would like to go for 600 or 700, then it has a dependency on sessions and processes parameter of database, and this is talking about the Oracle database specifically, and this is applicable for all of the database. Okay, so whenever we increase the maximum capacity of connection pool, that means we are asking the more connections, we are taking the more connections from the database, right? So if you are taking more connections from the database, then what exactly we need? We need the same capacity to be increased at the database level as well, right? So anytime when you go for the maximum connection pool increasing, the capacity increasing, then you have to check with your DBA then the current capacity of the sessions and process parameters, and tell him that or tell her that we are going to increase the maximum capacity from this to this. So you have to tune your sessions and process parameter as well. If that is not getting tuned, then you will not able to increase the capacity, because if you will increase it from the console and you are going to start your application or your data sources, then it will not get reinitialized. It will give you the error because the same capacity is not available at your database level. Okay, so that means there will be a calculation is there for the sessions and process, and your DBA is aware about that one, right? And one more thing, when we are talking about the increasing of capacity, then how we calculate the connections to the particular cluster. For example, I have a cluster with I have a 2 managed servers, and I have defined the maximum capacity as 400 for my data source. And if this data source is clustered targeted to my cluster where I have 2 managed servers, right? So what is the maximum number of connections that can be able to create at a time is 800. That means the calculation is your total number of managed servers on which you have targeted your data source multiplied by with the maximum capacity of data source, and this is the total number of concurrent connections that your application can create from the database, right? So if suppose that you are increasing the value from 400 to 200, right? So what exactly what is the total number of connections that you are increasing? We have two managed servers in the cluster, and for each you are increasing the 200 connections. That means you are going to create 400 more concurrent connections from the database, right? So you have to communicate this to your DBA that sir, we are going to increase the 400 more connections to our database based on the requirements. You have to tune your sessions and processes parameter so to cater this new demand.